Each night, a humble farm girl sat by candlelight, writing letters to a lonely cowboy she'd never met, words of comfort, friendship, and dreams she dared not speak aloud. His replies were kind, simple, almost too humble for who he truly was, because hidden beneath the dust and denim was a secret he never revealed. The cowboy she'd been writing to wasn't just any man. He was the governor's son, and her words had changed his heart forever. The wind picked up across the flatlands just before dusk, carrying dust and dry grass in slow spirals over ground that hadn't seen rain in weeks. It moved like something living, pressing through fence gaps and rattling the cedar posts that lined the property no one owned anymore. Out past the ridge, where the sun hung low and orange against the pale sky, a piece of paper lifted from the dirt and tumbled end over end across the open plain. It caught against a rusted barbed wire fence, fluttered there for a moment, then slipped free and kept moving, carried by the same gust that bent the sagebrush and stirred the manes of horses grazing in the distance. It traveled maybe half a mile before it hit the boot of a man sitting with his back against his saddle, hat tipped low over his eyes, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't move at first, just sat there in the shade of his horse, breathing slow and steady, the kind of stillness that comes from being alone too long. But the paper pressed against his leg, insistent, and after a moment he reached down and picked it up. The envelope was smudged with dirt, the edges worn soft like it had been handled more than once. No name on the front, just a single line written in looping ink, to whoever's still out there. He turned it over in his hands, calloused fingers careful not to tear it. For a long moment he just stared at those words, his thumb tracing the curve of the handwriting. Then he opened it. The letter inside was short, simple, written on lined paper that looked like it had been torn from a notebook, the kind you'd find in a general store or tucked into a schoolgirl's satchel. The ink was faded in places, smudged where a thumb had pressed too hard. It began without greeting. "I don't know if anyone will ever read this." Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's easier to speak when you know no one's listening. "My name is Clara May Holt. I live on my father's ranch about 10 miles west of Coldwater, though I suppose it's not much of a ranch anymore. The drought took most of the cattle last summer, and what little we had left got sold off to pay debts we couldn't shake. Now it's just me and my father, and the silence between us that neither of us knows how to fill. I write these letters because the quiet gets too heavy sometimes. I leave them in a tin box by the fence post at the edge of our property, and I imagine someone might find them, maybe a drifter passing through. Maybe the wind will carry them somewhere they're needed. I don't expect anything back. I just want to believe that somewhere, someone might understand what it's like to wake up every morning to the same sky, the same dust, the same feeling that the world forgot you were here. If you're reading this, thank you for being there, even if I'll never know your name. Yours in the quiet, Clara May." He read it twice, then a third time, slower, his eyes catching on phrases that felt like they'd been written just for him. The part about the silence, the part about being forgotten. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, then sat there as the sun dropped lower and the shadows stretched long across the plain. His horse shifted beside him, nosing at a patch of dry grass. He reached up and scratched its neck absently, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky in a line so straight it looked drawn with a ruler. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days, maybe longer. Out here, time moved different, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of work and rest, by the distance between water sources and the color of the sky at dawn. He'd grown used to it, preferred it even. The solitude suited him in ways he didn't like to examine too closely. But this letter, it stirred something he thought he'd buried years ago, a memory of what it felt like to be seen, to be heard, to matter to someone, even if only for a moment. He pulled his hat down tighter and stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. The wind had died down now, leaving the air still and heavy with the smell of sage and sun-baked earth. He looked out toward the west, where Clara May Holt said she lived, 10 miles. Not far, but far enough that their worlds had never crossed. He mounted his horse and turned south, back toward the line shack where he'd been staying the past month. But as he rode, the letter pressed against his chest where he'd tucked it inside his shirt, warm against his skin. That night, he sat by the campfire with the envelope in his hands again. The flames cast orange light across his face, half illuminating the hard lines around his eyes and mouth, half swallowing him in shadow. He read the letter once more, his lips moving silently over the words. When he finished, he set it down on the flat rock beside him and stared into the fire. The wood popped and hissed, sending sparks into the dark sky above. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, its voice thin and lonely. He thought about writing back. The idea felt foreign, almost foolish. What would he even say? What words could he offer a woman he'd never met, who poured her loneliness into a letter meant for no one? But the next morning, he found himself tearing a page from the small notebook he kept in his saddlebag. He sat on the edge of his bedroll with a pencil stub, staring at the blank paper for a long time, before he finally put the tip to the page. Miss Holt, I found your letter yesterday. I don't know if that was luck or something else, but I wanted you to know it didn't go unread. I'm no one important. Just a man who works the land and sleeps under the stars more often than not. I don't have much to offer in the way of comfort or wisdom, but I know what you mean about the quiet. I know what it's like to feel forgotten. You're not, though. Forgotten, I mean. Not by me. Not anymore. I'll leave this where I found yours. Maybe the wind will carry it back to you. Yours in the dust, E. He read it over once, frowned at how clumsy the words felt, then folded it before he could second-guess himself further. That afternoon, he rode out to the fence post where her letter had likely started its journey. There was no tin box in sight. Maybe it had been moved by weather or animals, but he tucked his reply beneath a stone at the base of the post and weighed it down with a flat piece of shale. Then he rode away without looking back. Miles away, Clara May Holt stood at the edge of her father's property, one hand shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. The wind tugged at her skirt and pulled loose strands of dark hair from the braid she'd tied that morning. She'd walked out here on a whim, carrying another letter she'd written the night before. Words she didn't expect anyone to read but wrote anyway because the act itself brought a strange kind of comfort. The tin box sat where she'd left it, wedged between two fence posts and half buried in the dust. She knelt down and pulled it free, brushing dirt from the lid before opening it. Empty, as always. She wasn't surprised. She never was. But still, a small part of her, the part that remembered what hope felt like, had wondered. She placed her new letter inside, closed the lid, and set the box back in its place. Then she stood and looked out over the open land, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill that crept in as the sun began to set. Her father would be waiting for her back at the house. He'd want supper, though he rarely ate more than a few bites these days. The illness that had taken root in his chest months ago was spreading, slow and relentless, stealing his strength piece by piece. The doctor said there wasn't much to be done. Not out here, not without money for medicine or travel to a city where they might have better options. So she stayed. She cooked and cleaned and tended the few animals they had left. She wrote letters to strangers and left them in the wind, because it was the only thing that made her feel like she wasn't disappearing along with everything else. She turned and started back toward the house, her footsteps soft in the dry grass. Behind her, the tin box sat silent in the fading light, waiting. 2 days later, when she returned to the fence post, the box was still there, but when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a folded piece of paper, not hers. The edges were rough, torn from a notebook, and the handwriting was different, bolder, less practiced. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and read it standing there in the wind, her heart beating faster with every word. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she smiled. That night, she sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, a single oil lamp flickering beside her as she carefully composed her reply. Her father was asleep in the next room, his breathing shallow and uneven. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. I didn't think anyone would answer. I didn't even know if anyone would find it, but you did, and now I don't feel quite so alone. Thank you for that. I don't know who you are or where you come from, but I want you to know that your words mattered. They still do. You said I'm not forgotten, and maybe that's the kindest thing anyone said to me in a long time. My father is sick. He won't admit it, but I can see it in the way he moves. Slower now, more careful, like every step costs him something he can't afford to give. I do what I can, but some days it feels like I'm just watching everything fall apart and there's nothing I can do to stop it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to burden you with this. But you asked what the quiet sounds like, and this is it. This is what it feels like to be here. If you write back, I'll be grateful. If you don't, I'll understand. Either way, thank you for finding me. Yours, Clara May. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the tin box the next morning before dawn, her breath misting in the cold air. Then she walked back to the house and began another day. The letters continued, one every few days at first, then more often, sometimes twice a week, sometimes 3 times, each one longer than the last, each one more honest. Clara wrote about her father's illness, about the ranch falling into disrepair, about the way the silence pressed down on her at night when she lay awake listening to the wind. She wrote about small things too, the way the light looked at sunrise, the sound of the horses in the corral, the songs she hummed to herself when no one was listening. And he answered, not with grand declarations or flowery prose, but with simple truths. He told her about the work he did, mending fences, herding cattle, fixing what was broken. He told her about the stars at night, how they looked different out here than they did anywhere else. He told her things he'd never said out loud, not even to himself. Through the letters, they began to know each other, not as strangers, but as something more. 2 people whose lives had never crossed but whose words fit together like pieces of a map, leading somewhere neither of them had expected to go. Clara found herself waiting for his replies the way she used to wait for rain, and when she read them, sitting alone in the kitchen or out by the fence post, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the first stars began to appear, she sat on the porch steps with his latest letter in her hands. He'd written about a storm he'd ridden through the week before, how the lightning had split the sky and the rain had come down so hard he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. But he'd made it through, and when the storm passed, everything had smelled clean and new. That's what your letters feel like, he'd written at the end. Like rain after a drought. Like something I didn't know I needed until it was here. She read that line 3 times, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. Inside the house, her father coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake the walls. She folded the letter and went inside, but the words stayed with her. That night, she wrote back by lamplight, her pen moving quickly across the page. You said my letters feel like rain. I think yours feel like shelter. I don't know if we'll ever meet. I don't know if this is something that can last beyond ink and paper. But I want you to know that whatever this is, it matters to me. You matter to me. Yours always, Clara May. She sealed the letter and set it aside, then blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, listening to her father's labored breathing in the next room. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying dust and dry grass across the plain. And somewhere out there, beneath the same stars, a man sat by a dying fire and thought about a woman he'd never met but couldn't stop thinking about. The prairie stretched between them, vast and endless. But in the space of words left in a tin box and carried by the wind, the distance didn't feel so far anymore. The tin box became a constant in her mornings. Clara would wake before dawn, slip out of bed without lighting the lamp, and pull on her boots in the gray half-light that seeped through the thin curtains. Her father never stirred. His sleep had grown heavier in recent weeks, deeper, as though he were sinking into some place she couldn't follow. She'd stand in the doorway of his room for a moment, listening to make sure his breathing was still there, still steady enough. Then she'd wrap her shawl around her shoulders and step out into the cold. The walk to the fence post took 15 minutes if she moved quickly. The grass crunched beneath her feet, stiff with frost, and her breath came out in small white clouds that dissolved in the air. By the time she reached the box, the sky would just be starting to lighten at the edges, deep blue bleeding into pale gold. She always opened it carefully, her fingers numb from the cold, half expecting it to be empty. But more often than not, there was something waiting, a folded page, his handwriting, words that felt like they'd been written just for her. She'd read them standing there, sometimes twice, before tucking the letter inside her shawl and heading back. And by the time she returned to the house to start the fire and make her father's breakfast, something in her chest felt lighter. His letters weren't long. He didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. But what he wrote, it mattered. He told her about the work that filled his days, mending fence lines that stretched for miles, tracking down stray cattle that wandered too far from the herd, sleeping under open sky more nights than not, his saddle for a pillow and the stars spread out above him like something holy. I used to think the quiet was a punishment, he wrote once. Something I deserved. But your letters make it feel different now, like maybe it was just waiting for something or someone to fill it. She read that line sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light slanting through the window and painting everything gold. Her father was asleep in the next room, and outside the wind moved through the dry grass in whispers. She pressed the letter flat against the wood and traced the words with her fingertip, memorizing the shape of them. That afternoon she wrote back, "E, I think the quiet was waiting for you too, for someone who'd understand what it means to be out here, where the world feels too big and too small all at once." My father didn't speak much today. He sat on the porch for a while this morning, staring out at the land, but I don't think he was really seeing it. Sometimes I wonder if he's already started leaving, if part of him is somewhere I can't reach anymore. It scares me, not just losing him, but what comes after. What happens when I'm the only one left here? When there's no one to take care of, no reason to stay, and nowhere else to go. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so heavy. You asked me once what I do to pass the time, and the truth is, I hum. Old songs my mother used to sing before she passed. I don't remember all the words anymore, but the melodies stay with me. They help when the nights get long. Do you ever sing, E, or are you the kind of man who keeps his music to himself? Yours, Clara May. She left the letter in the box that evening, just as the sun was setting. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. She stood there for a moment longer than usual, her hand resting on the lid of the tin, and wondered, not for the first time, who he really was. She knew his name was E. She knew he worked the land. She knew he wrote like a man who'd learned to say more with less. But beyond that, he was a mystery, a voice without a face, a presence that existed only in ink and paper, and somehow that was enough. Miles away, Elias Strand sat with his back against a cottonwood tree, her letter unfolded in his lap. The sun had dropped below the horizon, and the sky was darkening fast, but he could still make out her handwriting in the fading light. He read the part about her father again, then the part about the songs. He could almost hear her humming them, soft and low, the way people sing when they think no one's listening. He'd never told her his full name, never mentioned where he came from or what he'd been before he started calling himself a drifter. It wasn't dishonesty exactly, more like self-preservation. Out here, a man's past didn't matter as much as the work he could do and the word he kept, and Elias had spent the better part of 5 years making sure his past stayed buried. But with her, it felt different. Like maybe she wouldn't care about the name he'd been born with or the family he'd walked away from. Like maybe she'd see him for what he was now, not what he used to be. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his shirt, close to his chest where he kept all the others. There were more than a dozen now, stacked and pressed together, their edges softening from being carried everywhere he went. That night, he built a fire and sat watching the flames while his horse grazed nearby. The air was cold and clear, the kind of night where sound carried farther than it should. He could hear coyotes in the distance, their voices sharp and lonesome. He thought about her question, "Do you ever sing?" He hadn't not in years, but when he was younger, before everything fell apart, he used to. His mother had taught him old hymns and folk songs, the kind passed down through generations. He'd forgotten most of them, or thought he had. But sitting there in the firelight, with her letter pressed against his ribs, he found himself humming something low and half-remembered. The tune came back easier than the words, but it didn't matter. No one was there to hear him anyway, except maybe her, in some quiet way that had nothing to do with distance. The weeks turned over slow and steady, marked not by calendars, but by the rhythm of their correspondence. Clara began to look forward to his letters the way she used to look forward to spring, something that promised relief from the cold and the quiet. She'd find herself smiling as she read his words, even when they weren't about anything particularly joyful. Just knowing he was out there, thinking about her, writing to her. It was enough to make the days feel less heavy. She told him things she'd never told anyone. About the way her mother used to braid her hair before bed. About the time she'd tried to fix the roof herself and nearly fallen through. About the dreams she used to have before the drought came. Dreams of leaving, of seeing something beyond the flat horizon and the endless sky. "I don't dream like that anymore," she wrote. "But sometimes when I read your letters, I feel like maybe there's still something out there worth hoping for." And he answered with a kind of honesty that made her chest ache. "Clara May, I don't know if I'm worth hoping for. Most days I'm just a man trying to do right by the work in front of me. But if my letters give you something to hold on to, Then I'll keep writing them, as many as you need. You asked me once if I ever get lonely. The truth is, I've been lonely so long I forgot what it felt like not to be, until now. Yours, E. She read that letter 3 times before folding it and pressing it to her chest. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and the sky was growing dark. Her father was asleep again, his breathing shallow and uneven. She lit the lamp and sat down to write back, her hand moving quickly across the page. E. You're more than you think you are. I don't need to have met you to know that. I can feel it in the way you write, like you're trying to carry something heavy but doing it quietly, without asking for help. I wish I could tell you it gets easier. I wish I could promise that the loneliness fades, or that the quiet stops pressing in. But I can't. All I can tell you is that you're not alone in it anymore. Neither of us are. Yours always, Clara May. She sealed the letter and set it aside, then sat staring at the lamp flame until it began to blur. When she finally blew it out and climbed into bed, she thought about him out there somewhere beneath the same sky, reading her words by firelight. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid of the dark. But distance has a way of making people careless with secrets. Elias had been staying near the Coldwater area longer than he'd planned. Normally he moved every few weeks, drifting from ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions. But the letters had anchored him. He couldn't bring himself to ride too far from the fence post where they left their words for each other. He started taking work closer to town, fixing fences for a rancher named Calloway, helping at the livery stable when they needed an extra hand. Small jobs that paid enough to keep him fed and his horse watered. People noticed him, started nodding when he passed. A few even asked his name. He told them Eastrand. Nothing more. But one afternoon, while he was shoeing a horse outside the livery, a stagecoach rolled into town. It was finer than most. Polished wood and brass fittings, pulled by 4 matching horses, the kind of coach that didn't belong in a place like Coldwater. 2 men stepped out, both wearing tailored coats and polished boots. One of them carried a leather case under his arm. The other wore a pin on his lapel, a crest Elias recognized immediately, the governor's seal. He kept his head down and focused on the horse's hoof, but his hands had gone still. His heart was beating too fast. The men walked past him without a glance, heading toward the general store. But their presence hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Elias finished the shoe and led the horse back into the stable, then slipped out the side door and headed for the edge of town. He didn't stop until he was a mile out, standing in the open where he could breathe again. He told himself it didn't matter, that they weren't here for him, that no one knew who he really was. But the lie felt thinner than it used to. That evening, he rode out to the fence post and found her latest letter waiting. He opened it right there, standing in the fading light, and her words washed over him like cold water. E. Something happened today that made me think of you. A man came by the ranch, someone from town I didn't recognize. He said he'd heard my father was selling land, and he wanted to make an offer. I told him we weren't selling, but he didn't seem to believe me. He just smiled and said people always sell eventually, when the price gets high enough or the need gets desperate enough. I wanted to tell him to leave. I wanted to shout at him that this land is all we have left, and no amount of money could replace what it means. But I didn't. I just stood there and let him talk until he got bored and left. Why is it so hard to fight back when it matters most? I thought of you because you seem like the kind of person who knows how to stand your ground, who doesn't let people push you around. I wish I had that in me. Yours, Clara May. He read it twice, his jaw tight. Then he pulled out the pencil and paper he always carried now and wrote back right there in the dying light. Clara May, you have more strength than you know. Standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it just means not giving up when everything in you wants to. You haven't given up. You're still there, still taking care of your father, still writing these letters. That's not weakness, that's the kind of strength most people never find. As for me, I'm not as steady as you think. I've spent most of my life running from things I should have faced. The only reason I'm still here is because of you. Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're worth more than any piece of land. Yours, E. He left the letter in the box and rode back toward his camp, the sky above him darkening to deep indigo. But the image of those men in their fine coats lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something he couldn't control. The letters continued through the end of autumn and into the first breath of winter. The air grew colder, the mornings sharper. Clara wrapped herself in heavier shawls and made the walk to the fence post with frost clinging to her skirt. Her father's condition worsened. He stopped getting out of bed most days, stopped eating more than a few spoonfuls of broth. The doctor came once and left shaking his head, muttering about pneumonia and weak lungs and things that couldn't be undone. She wrote to Elias about it, not because she expected him to fix it, but because she needed someone to know, someone to bear witness to the slow unraveling of her world. "He's leaving me," she wrote one night, her handwriting shaky, "not all at once, but piece by piece, and I don't know how to hold on to him when he's already halfway gone." Elias read that letter by firelight, his chest tight. He wanted to ride to her, to stand on her porch and tell her she wasn't alone, but he didn't, because he knew that what she needed wasn't a stranger showing up uninvited. What she needed was exactly what he'd been giving her, words that didn't ask for anything in return. So he wrote back, "Clara May, I won't tell you it'll be all right. I won't pretend I know what you're going through, but I will tell you this. You doing everything you can. And when it's over, you'll know you were there. You didn't leave him. You didn't give up. That matters more than you think. I'll be here, as long as you need me. Yours, E." She read his letter, sitting beside her father's bed, her hand resting on his as he slept. And though the words didn't take away the pain, they made it feel just a little more bearable. Winter pressed in slowly, turning the world cold and brittle. But between the two of them, across miles of prairie and silence, something warm had taken root. A bridge built from paper and ink, fragile maybe, but strong enough to hold them both. For now, the decision came to him on a morning when the frost lay thick and white across everything, turning the world into something clean and breakable. Elias stood outside his camp, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm while he stared at the horizon. The sun was barely up, just a pale thread of light bleeding into the gray sky. His horse stood nearby, its breath misting in the cold air. He'd been thinking about it for days, weeks maybe. The idea had started as something small and easily ignored, a whisper in the back of his mind that grew louder every time he read one of her letters, every time she wrote about her father's labored breathing, or the way the silence in that house pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't lift. She needed help, real help, not just words on paper, and he was tired of hiding behind distance. He drained the last of the coffee, poured the rest over the dying embers of his fire, and began packing his gear. The movements were automatic, rolling his blanket, checking the saddle straps, making sure his canteen was full, but his hands felt steadier than they had in years, like he'd finally made a choice that didn't involve running away. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he was riding west. The land between where he'd been staying and the Holt Ranch was open and unforgiving. Miles of flat prairie broken only by the occasional rise or gully, dotted with sagebrush and yucca. The sky stretched overhead in a pale dome that seemed to press down on everything beneath it. He rode at an easy pace, letting his horse set the rhythm. There was no hurry. He'd get there when he got there, but as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, something tight began to form in his chest. A knot of anticipation and fear that he couldn't quite untangle. What would he say when he saw her? How would he explain showing up unannounced after months of letters that never once suggested they should meet? He didn't have good answers, but he kept riding anyway. By late afternoon, he crested a low ridge and saw the ranch spread out below him in the valley. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a single-story house with a sagging porch and a roof that looked like it had seen better decades. A barn leaning slightly to one side. A corral with a few horses standing head down in the dust. Everything about it looked tired, used up. He pulled his horse to a stop and sat there for a long moment, just looking. Somewhere down there was Clara May Holt, the woman whose words he'd been carrying next to his heart for months, the woman who'd made him feel like maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. He adjusted his hat, checked that his shirt was tucked in, and urged his horse forward. Clara was in the corral when she first saw him. She'd been trying to coax one of the horses closer, an old mare with a lame front leg that needed tending, but the animal was skittish and wouldn't let her near. She'd spent the better part of an hour just standing there, speaking softly, waiting for the mare to trust her enough to approach. She didn't notice the rider coming down the ridge until he was almost at the fence line. When she looked up, her first thought was that it was someone from town. Another man coming to ask about buying the land or offering help she couldn't afford to accept. Her stomach tightened, and she straightened, brushing the dust from her hands. But as he got closer, something about him made her pause. He rode like someone who'd spent his whole life on horseback, easy and unhurried, his posture relaxed but alert. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and his clothes were worn but clean. When he reached the edge of the property, he stopped and dismounted in one smooth motion, then stood there holding the reins, looking at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he took off his hat, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He wasn't old, maybe mid-30s, but his face carried the kind of lines that came from sun and wind and years spent outdoors. His eyes were dark, steady, and when they met hers, something in her chest fluttered and dropped. She knew him, not his face, but something about the way he looked at her, like he'd been seeing her long before this moment. "Miss Holt?" His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. She nodded slowly, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, my name's Elias." He paused, then added, "Elias Strand, though you might know me as Eek." The world seemed to tilt. She stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. The man who'd been writing to her for months, the voice she knew better than almost anyone's. He was standing right there, 20 feet away, real and solid, and looking at her like he wasn't sure if she'd welcome him or send him away. "You." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "You found me. I did." He took a step closer, then stopped, as though afraid of crossing some invisible line. "I know I should have written first, asked if it was all right, but He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. "I thought maybe you could use a hand. With the ranch, with your father." She wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in her throat. He was here, the man whose letters had been the only light in months of darkness. And he was offering help she desperately needed but didn't know how to ask for. Before she could answer, a sound came from the house, a harsh, rattling cough that carried across the yard. Her father. She turned toward the house, her face going pale. "I have to go." Elias's voice was firm but gentle. "I'll wait here." She hesitated for only a moment, then gathered her skirts and ran. Inside, her father was sitting up in bed, his face flushed and his breathing labored. She helped him lie back down, pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, and spoke to him in low, soothing tones until the coughing subsided and his breathing evened out. By the time she stepped back outside, the sky had begun to shift toward dusk. The light was softer now, golden and slanted, painting everything in warm tones that felt almost unreal. Elias was still there. He'd moved his horse to the water trough and was standing beside it, one hand resting on the saddle. When he saw her, he straightened. She walked toward him slowly, her arms wrapped around herself. "I'm sorry." She stopped, not sure how to finish. "You don't need to explain." Elias's eyes were kind. "Is he all right? For now?" She looked back at the house, then at him. "It comes and goes. The coughing, the fever. Some days are better than others." Elias nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like something they'd both grown used to. Distance made close by words left in a tin box. "I don't know what to say," Claire admitted finally. "I never thought—" She shook her head. "I didn't think you were real. Not like this." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm real. Why did you come?" He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "Because I couldn't stay away anymore." The words settled between them, simple and honest. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him how much his letters had meant, how they'd been the only thing keeping her tethered to something beyond the slow collapse of her world. But all she managed was, "Would you like some coffee? I'd like that." They sat on the porch as the sun sank lower, turning the sky orange and pink. Clara brought out 2 chipped mugs of coffee, strong and bitter, the way she'd learned to make it when supplies ran low, and they drank in silence, watching the light fade. Elias didn't ask questions, didn't push. He just sat there beside her, his presence steady and calm. And for the first time in months, Clara didn't feel like she was carrying everything alone. After a while, she spoke. "The mare in the corral, she's got a bad leg. I've been trying to get close enough to check it, but she won't let me near." "I could take a look," Elias offered. "If you'd like." She glanced at him. "You know horses?" "Enough." They stood and walked to the corral together. The mare eyed them warily from the far side, but when Elias stepped through the gate and moved toward her, slow and deliberate, she didn't bolt. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, words Clara couldn't quite make out, and after a few minutes, The mare let him approach. He knelt beside her, ran his hands gently down her leg, and examined the swelling near her fetlock. "It's not bad," he said over his shoulder. "Just needs rest and a poultice. I can help with that, if you've got the supplies." Clara nodded. "I do." They worked together as the last light drained from the sky. Elias mixed the poultice while Clara held the mare's halter, speaking softly to keep her calm. When he wrapped the leg, his hands were careful and sure, and Clara found herself watching him more than the horse. He moved like someone who'd spent his whole life fixing things that were broken. By the time they finished, the stars were beginning to appear overhead, small pinpricks of light scattered across the deepening blue. Clara led the mare to the far side of the corral where there was fresh hay, and Elias leaned against the fence, his arms crossed, watching. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. He turned to look at her. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." She hesitated, then added, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." "You would have managed." His voice was certain. "You always do." She wanted to believe that. But standing there in the dark with him beside her, she realized how tired she was of managing, how good it felt to have someone else there, sharing the weight. "Will you stay?" The words came out before she could stop them. "Just for tonight. There's room in the barn and—" "I'll stay," he said, cutting her off gently. "As long as you need." Relief flooded through her, so strong it made her knees weak. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and they walked back toward the house together. That night, Elias made his bed in the barn. It wasn't much, just a pile of old hay and a blanket he'd brought with him, but it was dry and out of the wind, and that was more than enough. He lay on his back, staring up at the rafters, and thought about the day, about the way Clara had looked at him when she realized who he was, about the quiet strength in her voice when she'd asked him to stay. He'd spent 5 years running from the life he'd been born into, 5 years trying to be someone other than the governor's son, and for the first time since he'd left, he felt like maybe he'd found something worth staying for, not a place, a person. Inside the house, Clara sat beside her father's bed, listening to his breathing. It was shallow and uneven, but steady enough. She reached out and took his hand. Thin and papery now, so different from the strong hand she remembered from childhood. "There's a man here," she said softly, even though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "Someone who came to help. I think you'd like him." Her father didn't answer, didn't stir. But she thought she felt his fingers tighten around hers just for a moment. She sat with him until his breathing deepened into sleep, then stood and walked to the window. Outside, the barn was a dark shape against the stars. Somewhere inside it, Elias Strand was resting, the man who'd written her letters in the dust. The man who'd ridden all this way just to make sure she wasn't alone. She pressed her hand to the cold glass and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel something she'd almost forgotten, gratitude. And beneath it, something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. But in the town 10 miles east, shadows were already beginning to move. A man in a fine coat stood in the dim light of the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He'd been asking questions all evening, quiet questions, the kind that didn't draw too much attention, about ranches in the area, about families struggling to hold on to land, about a man who'd been seen riding west. And when someone mentioned the name Strand, his eyes sharpened. He drained his glass, set it down on the bar, and walked out into the night. The stars overhead were cold and distant, and somewhere in the darkness the first threads of trouble were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that neither Clara nor Elias could yet see. But the wind knew. It always did. And it carried the warning across the prairie in whispers no one thought to hear. The morning came quiet and cold, the kind that made breath visible and turned water to ice in the buckets overnight. Elias woke before dawn, as he always did, his body trained by years of rising with the sun. He lay still for a moment in the hay, listening to the sounds of the barn around him, the soft shuffle of horses, the creak of wood settling, the distant call of a rooster somewhere across the valley. Then he stood, brushed the hay from his clothes, and stepped outside. The world was still dark, but the eastern horizon was beginning to pale. He walked to the water pump and worked the handle until it groaned and released a thin stream. He splashed his face, the cold shocking him fully awake, then filled a bucket for the horses. By the time Clara emerged from the house, he'd already fed the animals and was checking the fence line near the corral. She stopped on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and watched him for a moment. There was something steadying about the way he moved, purposeful but unhurried, like a man who knew the value of work done right. She'd spent so many months alone, trying to hold everything together with hands that felt too small for the task. Seeing someone else shoulder even a piece of it made something in her chest loosen. "You're up early," she called. He turned, touched the brim of his hat. "Habit." She walked toward him, her boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know." He tested the tension on a wire, then moved to the next post. "But I'm here. Might as well be useful." She stood beside him, arms crossed against the cold. "My father used to do this. Every morning before the sun came up, he'd walk the whole property, checking everything, making sure nothing had broken in the night." Her voice grew softer. "He hasn't been able to do it in over a year." Elias glanced at her, then back at the fence. "I can keep doing it, long as I'm here." The words hung between them, and Clara felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. "Long as I'm here. Not a promise, not permanence, just an offering of time and labor with no expectation attached." "I'd be grateful," she said quietly. They worked together through the morning. Elias mended what needed mending while Clara tended to her father, brought him broth he barely touched, and changed the cloth on his forehead when the fever rose again. By midday, when the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the frost, they met on the porch. Clara brought out bread and cold meat, simple fare but filling. They ate without talking much, the silence between them comfortable in a way that felt earned. "I need to ride into town," Clara said eventually, "for medicine and flour. We're running low." Elias looked up. "I'll go with you." She hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know." His eyes met hers steady. "But I'd feel better if I did." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she'd been making this trip alone for months and didn't need looking after. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of doing everything alone. Tired of being strong when all she wanted was to let someone else carry the weight for a while. "All right," she said. "We'll leave in an hour." The ride into Coldwater took just under an hour. They rode side by side, Elias on his horse and Clara on the old mare that wasn't lame anymore, thanks to his work. The road was rutted and dry, cutting through open land that stretched flat and endless in every direction. They didn't talk much during the ride, but Clara found herself glancing at him more than once, taking in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested easy on the reins, the quiet vigilance in the way he scanned the horizon. She'd read his letters so many times she could recite whole passages from memory, but seeing him here, solid and real beside her, was different. The words had given her a sense of who he was. But this, the physical presence of him, filled in details she hadn't known she was missing. When the town came into view, a cluster of buildings huddled together like they were trying to keep warm, Clara felt her stomach tighten. She'd always hated coming here, hated the way people looked at her, pitying or dismissive depending on the day, hated the whispers that followed her down the street, words about her father's failing ranch and the girl who couldn't hold together, but with Elias beside her, the weight of it felt lighter. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Clara went inside while Elias waited on the porch. The interior was dim and smelled of wood and dry goods. Mr. Hadley, the shopkeeper, looked up from behind the counter and nodded. "Miss Holt, Mr. Hadley." She handed him her list. "I'll need these. And whatever medicine you have that might help with fever and cough." He scanned the list, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "This'll come to about $8. Her heart sank. She'd counted her money 3 times before leaving, hoping it would be enough. "I have 6. Hadley sighed, the sound heavy with judgment. "I can't keep extending credit, Miss Holt. Your father already owes—" "I know what he owes." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She took a breath, steadied herself. "Please, just the flour and the medicine. I can do without the rest." He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right, but this is the last time." She paid him what she had and took the small bundle he wrapped for her. As she turned to leave, she heard voices outside, low and agitated. Through the window, she saw a small crowd gathering near the horses. Her stomach dropped. Elias was still standing on the porch, but he wasn't alone anymore. 3 men had approached him, one older, heavy-set, with a thick gray beard, and 2 younger men flanking him. Clara recognized the older man, Samuel Briggs, a rancher who owned half the land around Coldwater and had been trying to buy the other half for years. Just saying it's mighty convenient, Briggs was saying, his voice loud enough to carry. Stranger rides into town, starts spending time at the Holt place. Man's got to wonder what your interest is. Elias's expression hadn't changed. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. My interest is my own, not when it concerns folks in this town. Briggs took a step closer. We look after our own here, and the Holts have been here a long time. We don't take kindly to drifters sniffing around, thinking they can take advantage of a girl in a hard spot. I'm not taking advantage of anyone. That's so. One of the younger men spoke up, his tone mocking. Then what are you doing out there? Playing Good Samaritan? Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. Helping? Briggs laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Helping. Right, just like every other smooth, talking saddle tramp who... That's enough. Clara's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stepped off the porch and moved to stand beside Elias, her eyes locked on Briggs. Mr. Strand is a guest on my property. What he does there is none of your concern. Briggs's expression hardened. Miss Holt, I'm only trying to look out for your interests. You're a young woman alone and... I'm not alone. She held his gaze. Not anymore. The words landed heavier than she'd meant them to. Briggs's mouth thinned, and the two younger men exchanged glances. Then one of them spoke, a tall man with cold eyes and a voice like gravel. Strand, you said? He looked Elias up and down. That name sounds familiar. Elias went very still. The man's eyes narrowed. Yeah, I knew I'd heard it somewhere. Strand. Like the governor's family. Old Josiah Strand up in the Capitol. He smiled, slow and mean. You wouldn't happen to be related, would you? The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Clara looked at Elias, confusion flickering across her face. But Elias wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the man in front of him, and something in his expression had gone cold and distant. You're him, aren't you? The man took a step forward. The son. The one who disappeared years ago. Folks said you ran off after some scandal. Something about money. Or was it a woman? You don't know what you're talking about. Elias's voice was low, dangerous. But the damage was done. The words had been spoken, and the crowd around them had grown. Clara could feel eyes on them now, curious, judgmental, eager for gossip. Briggs laughed again, this time with genuine delight. Well, I'll be damned. The governor's boy, playing cowboy out here in the dirt. He turned to Clara. You know about this, Miss Holt? You know who you've been letting stay on your property? Clara's mind was spinning. Governor's son. The words didn't make sense. Elias was... He was E, the man who wrote her letters. The man who'd helped her with the mare and fixed her fences and sat with her on the porch drinking bad coffee. He wasn't... She looked at him, searching his face for some kind of explanation. But he wouldn't meet her eyes. Elias? Her voice came out small. He finally turned to her, and the look on his face made her chest ache. It was shame. Raw and undisguised. Clara. He started to reach for her, then stopped. I can explain. Can you? Her voice was shaking now. Were you ever going to tell me? I didn't think it mattered. Didn't think it mattered. She took a step back, her hands trembling. You let me believe you were, that we were... She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't put words to the betrayal that was flooding through her. She'd trusted him. She'd let him into her life, into her heart, and the whole time he'd been hiding who he really was. Clara, please, don't. She held up a hand. Just don't. She turned and walked back to her horse, her vision blurring. Behind her, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd growing louder, voices layering over each other in a tide of judgment and speculation. Governor's son, imagine that. Probably playing with her. Rich boys always do. Poor girl doesn't even know she's being used. She mounted the mare with shaking hands and rode away without looking back. Elias stood there in the street, watching her go. The crowd around him had started to disperse, their interest waning now that the spectacle was over, but Briggs and his men remained, their expressions smug. Looks like your welcome just ran out, Briggs said. Elias turned on him, and whatever Briggs saw in his eyes made him take a step back. Stay away from her, Elias said, his voice quiet and deadly. You hear me? You stay away from that ranch, and you stay away from Clara May Holt. Briggs recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. Or what? You'll run crying to your daddy the governor? My father's dead. The words came out flat, empty. Has been for 3 months. That wiped the smile off Briggs's face. Elias turned and walked to his horse, mounted, and rode out of town. He didn't follow Clara, didn't try to catch up. He knew she wouldn't want to see him right now. Maybe wouldn't ever want to see him again. So he rode in the opposite direction, away from the Holt Ranch, away from the only place he'd felt like he belonged in 5 years. Clara didn't stop riding until she was home. She dismounted in a rush, left the mare at the corral, and went straight into the house. Her father was still in bed, his breathing labored, and for a moment she just stood in the doorway, looking at him. Everything felt like it was crumbling. The ranch, her father, and now this, the one thing that had been keeping her afloat, the one person she thought she could trust. She walked to the small desk in the corner and pulled open the drawer where she kept his letters. They were all there, stacked neatly, the paper soft from being read and reread. She picked up the top one and stared at the handwriting. "You're not forgotten. Not by me." The words blurred. She crushed the letter in her fist and threw it across the room. Then she sank to the floor and let herself cry. Miles away, Elias sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, his horse grazing beside him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, but he didn't see it. He was staring at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of work, and thinking about the look on Clara's face when she'd realized who he was. He'd known this would happen eventually, known that his past would catch up with him, but he'd hoped, foolishly, that maybe it wouldn't matter, that maybe she'd see him for who he was now, not who he'd been born as. But hope was a dangerous thing, and now it was gone. He pulled the last letter she'd written him from his pocket. The paper was worn at the creases, soft from being carried everywhere. He read it one more time, his chest tight. "You matter to me." He folded it carefully, pressed it to his forehead and closed his eyes. Then he tucked it back inside his shirt, next to all the others, and watched the sun disappear below the horizon. Behind him, the darkness spread across the land like ink spilled across paper. And somewhere in that darkness the distance between them felt wider than it ever had before. But even in the worst silences, some truths refused to stay buried. And morning, when it came, would bring choices neither of them could avoid. The news reached Coldwater 3 days before he did. It came by telegraph first, a brief, official message delivered to the town marshal's office, then by newspaper, brought in on the morning stage. By noon, everyone in town knew Governor Josiah Strand was dead. Pneumonia, they said. Took him quick in the end, though he'd been ailing for months. And his son, the one who disappeared 5 years ago, the one who'd been living under their noses for weeks, was coming back to settle the estate. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house and made it her business to know everything that happened in Coldwater before anyone else did. She'd come to the ranch under the pretense of bringing food, a casserole Clara didn't need and wouldn't eat, but really she'd come to see the look on Clara's face when she delivered the news. "They say he'll be here by week's end," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Coming to take possession of the governor's holdings. Land, investments, the whole estate. Can you imagine? All that wealth just falling into his lap." Clara stood on the porch, her arms crossed, her face carefully blank. "Thank you for the casserole, Mrs. Patterson." "Of course, dear." The older woman's eyes gleamed. "I just thought you should know, in case he tries to come around again. A man like that, with that kind of money, he won't have time for." She gestured vaguely at the ranch, at Clara, at the worn boards and peeling paint. "Well, you understand." Clara understood perfectly. She took the casserole, thanked Mrs. Patterson again, and closed the door in her face. Inside, she set the dish on the table and stood there for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the wood. Her father was asleep in the next room, his breathing wet and shallow. The doctor had stopped coming. There was nothing more to be done, he'd said. Just a matter of time now. Everything was a matter of time. She walked to the window and looked out at the land, dry and cracked, dotted with scrub brush and dust. The fence posts Elias had mended stood straight and solid. The corral where he'd treated the mare's leg. The barn where he'd slept that one night before everything fell apart. She tried not to think about him these past weeks. Tried to push him out of her mind the same way she'd pushed his letters to the bottom of the drawer, where she wouldn't have to see them. But now, knowing he was coming back, not as the quiet drifter who'd answered her letters, but as something else entirely. She couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. Governor's son, heir to an estate, a man from a world so far removed from hers they might as well have been living on different planets. She'd been a fool to think his letters meant what she'd wanted them to mean. A fool to believe that the distance between them was just miles, not an unbridgeable gap of class and circumstance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Clara turned away from the window and went to sit with her father. Elias rode into Coldwater on a gray morning, when the sky hung low and heavy, with the threat of rain that wouldn't come. He looked different. Clean-shaven now, his hair trimmed, wearing clothes that fit properly, a dark suit and a pressed white shirt, polished boots instead of worn leather. He rode a different horse, too, a tall black gelding with good lines and a steady gait. Everything about him looked deliberate, controlled, but his eyes, they still carried the same weight they always had. He stopped first at the marshal's office, where papers were waiting. Documents that needed signatures, deeds that needed transferring, a dozen legal matters that turned a man's death into columns of numbers and official seals. He signed what needed signing, his handwriting firm and clear, and asked no questions about what came next. The marshal, a tired-looking man named Garrett, watched him with undisguised curiosity. "Heard you've been in the area a while. Staying out at the Holt place?" Elias's jaw tightened. Shame about her father. Heard he's not doing well. "No, he's not." Garrett leaned back in his chair. "You planning on staying? Now that you've come into the governor's estate?" Elias looked at him for a long moment. "I'm staying, but not for the estate. Then what for? That's my business." He walked out before Garrett could ask anything else. By midday, word had spread. The governor's son was in town, and he was holding court in the old land office, the building his father had used as a base of operations whenever he'd visited Coldwater to oversee his investments. People came in waves, curious townspeople, businessmen with proposals, farmers who owed debts to the Strand estate and wanted to know if the son would be as ruthless as the father had been. Elias sat behind the wide oak desk and listened to them all. He didn't make promises, didn't offer false hope, but he listened. And when each person finished speaking, he made notes in a leather-bound ledger and told them he'd be in touch. By late afternoon, Samuel Briggs arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his expression a mix of deference and calculation. "Mr. Strand, good to see you back in proper clothes. That drifter act had me fooled, I'll admit." Elias didn't stand, didn't offer his hand. "What do you want, Briggs?" Briggs settled into the chair across from him, uninvited. "Just wanted to pay my respects, and to discuss a business matter if you've got time. This won't take long." Briggs leaned forward, his smile predatory. "I've had my eye on the Holt property for a while now. Prime land, good water access. The old man's too sick to work it, and the girl, well, she's doing her best, but it's only a matter of time before she has to sell. I was hoping to make her an offer, but I thought, given your connection to the family, you might want to facilitate the transaction. Make it easier on everyone." Elias's hands, resting on the desk, curled slowly into fists. "No," Briggs blinked. "No. The Holt Ranch isn't for sale. And if it were, you'd be the last person I'd let anywhere near it." Briggs's smile faded. "Now hold on. Get out." Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something immovable. Briggs stood, his face reddening. "You think you can come back here and start giving orders? Your daddy might have had pull in this town, but you're just a boy playing at being important. You don't know how things work here. I know exactly how things work." Elias stood now, and despite being several inches shorter than Briggs, he seemed to fill the room. "My father spent years buying up debt and squeezing people until they had nothing left. He used this town like it was his personal property. I won't do the same. Then what will you do? Fix what he broke?" Briggs stared at him, confusion and anger warring on his face. Then he spat on the floor and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Elias sat back down and pressed his palms against his eyes. The weight of what he'd inherited pressed down on him, not the money or the land, but the damage. The lives his father had twisted and broken in pursuit of power. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing, a list of names, families who owed debts to the Strand estate, mortgages his father had held over people's heads like weapons. He worked late into the evening, going through ledgers and documents, tallying numbers. When he finally looked up, it was full dark outside, and his eyes were burning. But he had what he needed. The next morning, notices went up all over town. They were simple, handwritten on heavy paper, nailed to the doors of the general store, the saloon, the church. People gathered to read them, murmuring in disbelief. All debts owed to the Strand estate are hereby forgiven. Mortgages held by Governor Josiah Strand are released without penalty. No repayment is expected or required. Land seized for non-payment will be returned to original owners where possible. Families displaced by foreclosure will be offered restitution. This is not charity, it is recompense for damage done. Elias Strand. By noon, the murmurs had turned to shouts. Some people wept. Others stood in stunned silence, reading the notice over and over, as if they couldn't believe the words wouldn't change. The Johnsons, who'd lost their farm 3 years ago, their land would be returned. The widow Miller, who'd been weeks away from losing her home, her mortgage was gone. A dozen other families, maybe more, suddenly freed from debts that had been crushing them for years. And at the center of it all was Elias Strand, the man who'd disappeared into the dust and come back carrying redemption in his saddlebags. But there was one place he didn't go, one name he didn't speak. The Holt Ranch sat quiet on the edge of the valley, untouched by the wave of mercy sweeping through Coldwater. Clara heard about what Elias was doing for Mrs. Patterson, who came by again with another casserole and an expression of barely contained excitement. Can you believe it? Just giving it all away. Thousands of dollars just gone. They're saying he's mad. Or noble. Depends on who you ask. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I heard he's been asking about you. Clara's heart stuttered. What? Oh yes. Asking the marshal if you'd been into town. If you needed anything. Apparently he's very concerned about your welfare. Mrs. Patterson's eyes gleamed. Though he hasn't come out here himself, has he? Too proud, I suppose. Or maybe he knows he's not welcome. Clara said nothing, just took the casserole and closed the door. But Mrs. Patterson's words stayed with her. He's been asking about you. She wanted to feel angry, wanted to hold on to the hurt and betrayal that had filled her chest when she'd learned who he really was. But all she felt was tired and confused and something else, something she didn't want to name. That afternoon, she walked out to the fence post. The tin box was still there, rusted and dented, half buried in dust. She opened it. Inside was a single envelope, new, unweathered. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she'd know anywhere. She stared at it for a long time before finally taking it out. Her hands shook as she unfolded the letter inside. Clara May, I won't ask you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. I lied to you, not with words, but with silence. I let you believe I was someone I'm not. Or maybe I let myself believe it too. My father died 3 months ago. I didn't go to his funeral. Didn't claim the inheritance until I had no choice. I've spent 5 years trying to be anyone other than his son. And the thought of becoming him, of stepping into his world, made me sick. But I can't run anymore. Not from what he did. Not from what I owe. I'm using his money to undo some of the damage he caused. It won't fix everything. It won't bring back what people lost. But it's a start. I wanted you to know that everything I wrote to you was true. The man who answered your letters, that's who I am. Not the name, not the inheritance. Just a man who found something worth staying for. I don't expect you to answer this. I don't expect anything. But I needed you to know. The Holt Ranch, I looked into the debts. Your father doesn't owe anything to the Strand estate, but there are others. Medical bills. Loans from the bank. I can help with those, if you'll let me. Not as charity, as something I should have offered from the beginning. I'm leaving the choice with you. If you want my help, leave a letter here. If you don't, I'll understand. Either way, you were right about one thing. Your letters did feel like rain. And for a while, I forgot what it was like to be thirsty. Yours, E. She read it twice, then a third time. Then she folded it and pressed it against her chest, her eyes closed. Inside the house, her father was dying. The ranch was failing, and she was so tired of carrying everything alone. But this, accepting help from Elias, from the governor's son, felt like admitting defeat, like proving everyone right who'd said she couldn't manage on her own. She stood there for a long time, the letter in her hands, the wind pulling at her hair. Then she walked back to the house and sat down at the table with a pen and paper. Her hand hovered over the page for several minutes before she finally began to write. E. I don't know how to forgive you yet. I don't know if I can. But I do know that my father is dying, and I can't afford pride anymore. If you meant what you said about helping, then yes, I need help. Not for me, for him. so he can die without the weight of debt pressing down on him. That's all I'm asking for. Don't come to the house. Don't try to see me. Just do what you said you'd do, and let that be enough. Clara May. She folded the letter, sealed it, and carried it back to the fence post before she could change her mind. Then she walked home and sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand in the fading afternoon light. The next morning, Elias found the letter. He read it standing in the cold dawn air, his breath misting, his chest tight. Don't come to the house. Don't try to see me. It hurt more than he'd expected, but he understood, and he'd do what she asked. He folded the letter carefully and put it with all the others, then went back to town and set to work. Within 2 days, Clara's medical bills were paid. The loan at the bank settled in full. Supplies were delivered to the ranch, flour, medicine, firewood, with no name attached, though everyone knew where they'd come from. Elias didn't visit, didn't ride past the property. He kept his distance as she'd asked. But every evening he rode out to a ridge overlooking the valley, and he sat there in the fading light, looking at the small house in the distance, and wondered if she knew how much those letters had saved him, if she knew that every act of mercy he performed now was because she'd shown him what kindness looked like when it was given without expectation. The sun would set, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and he'd stay until full dark before riding back to town. Below him, smoke rose from the chimney of the Holt Ranch, and though the distance between them hadn't closed, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile possibility of it, and for now that was enough. Her father died on a morning when the clouds finally broke. Clara had been sitting beside his bed, holding his hand as she'd done every night for weeks, when his breathing changed. It didn't stop all at once, just grew softer, slower, like a tide pulling back from shore. She felt his fingers loosen in hers, felt the warmth begin to fade, and she knew. "Papa," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she wanted to say. "Thank you, maybe, or I'm sorry, or just goodbye." But the words stuck in her throat, so she just held his hand and watched the first light of dawn creep through the window. When it was over, when the stillness became absolute, she closed his eyes gently and pulled the blanket up to his chest. Then she sat there for a long time, not moving, not crying, just existing in the space between what had been and what would come next. Outside, the sky had turned gray, and as she finally stood and walked to the window, the first drops of rain began to fall. It rained for 3 days straight. Not the violent storms that tore across the plains with thunder and lightning, but a steady, gentle rain that soaked into the earth and turned the dust to mud. The kind of rain people had been praying for since the drought began. Clara stood on the porch the morning after her father's death and watched it come down. The sound of it on the roof was almost hypnotic, a constant drumming that filled the silence he'd left behind. The funeral was small. A handful of townspeople came, more out of obligation than affection, she suspected. Mrs. Patterson brought another casserole. The minister said words Clara didn't really hear. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky that wept with her. She stood at the grave long after everyone else had gone, rain soaking through her black dress, and tried to feel something other than numb. When she finally walked back to the house, her boots were caked with mud, and her hands were shaking from cold. But the rain kept falling, and she stood in it, letting it wash over her. Elias heard about Samuel Holt's passing the same day it happened. He was in the land office, going through another stack of documents, when Marshal Garrett stopped by with the news. "Thought you'd want to know," Garrett said, his tone neutral. "Miss Holt's father passed this morning." Elias's pen stopped moving. He set it down carefully, his hands very still. "When's the funeral?" "Day after tomorrow, assuming the rain lets up enough to dig." Elias nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Garrett lingered in the doorway. "You planning on going?" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended. "She doesn't want me there. You sure about that?" Elias looked up, his eyes dark. "She told me not to come to the house, not to try to see her. I'm respecting her wishes." Garrett shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just seems like a time when a person might need friends, whether they say so or not." After he left, Elias sat staring at the papers in front of him without seeing them. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a band around his ribs and was pulling it tighter with each breath. He wanted to go to her, wanted to stand beside her at that funeral and shoulder some of the grief she had to be carrying, but she'd asked him to stay, away, and he'd already broken her trust once. so he stayed where he was. That evening he rode out to the ridge overlooking the valley as he'd done every night since returning to Coldwater. But this time he didn't just sit and watch. He dismounted and stood in the rain, letting it soak through his clothes, and stared at the small house in the distance. Somewhere down there Clara was alone, grieving, and he couldn't be there for her. The helplessness of it ate at him. He stayed until dark, then rode back to town in silence, the rain drumming against his hat and shoulders. On the third day after the funeral, the rain finally stopped. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window, bright and clean, the kind of light that makes everything look newly made. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the silence, then got up and walked outside. The world had transformed. The land, which had been brown and cracked for as long as she could remember, was beginning to green. Tiny shoots of grass were pushing up through the mud. The air smelled fresh and alive, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. It was beautiful, and it hurt to look at. Her father had prayed for rain like this for years, had watched his herd die and his land turn to dust, hoping every morning that the sky would finally open. And now that it had, now that everything was coming back to life, he wasn't here to see it. She walked out past the corral, past the barn, all the way to the fence post where the tin box sat. The rain had pooled around it, and when she pulled it free, water dripped from the hinges. She opened it, not expecting anything. But inside was an envelope, sealed tight against the weather. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and tore it open. Clara May, I heard about your father. I'm so sorry. I wanted to be there, at the funeral, just to stand with you. But I know you asked me to stay away, and I'm trying to honor that, even though it's the hardest thing I've ever done. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that you don't know if you can forgive me. I understand that. I don't know if I'd forgive me either. But I want you to know that everything I'm doing now, every debt I am forgiving, every person I'm trying to help, it's because of you. Because your letters taught me that kindness isn't weakness, that mercy isn't something to be ashamed of. You made me want to be better than I was, better than my father, better than the name I was born into. I know you're alone now. I know the ranch is probably more than one person can handle. If you need help, real help, not just money, I'm here. All you have to do is ask. But if you don't want that, I'll understand. I'll stay away. I'll keep my distance. Whatever you need, just please know that you're not forgotten, not by me, not ever. Yours, E. She read it twice, standing in the mud with the sun warming her shoulders. Then she folded it and pressed it against her chest. For weeks she'd been angry at him, hurt by his deception. But standing there in the aftermath of her father's death, reading his words, she realized something. She was tired of being angry, tired of carrying the weight of betrayal on top of everything else. And beneath the hurt, beneath the anger, there was something else, something that had been there since the first letter. A connection she couldn't name or dismiss. A sense that somewhere in the world, there was someone who understood her in a way no one else ever had. She walked back to the house, pulled out paper and pen, and sat at the table. For a long time she just stared at the blank page. Then, slowly, she began to write. E, thank you for staying away. It was what I needed. But I think I'm ready now. Not for everything, not all at once, but maybe for a start. The ranch is too much for me alone. You're right about that. I've been trying to do everything myself, and I'm failing. The fences need work. The barn roof is leaking. There's 100 things I don't know how to fix. I'm not asking you to fix them. But if you meant what you said about helping, then yes, I could use help. You can come by tomorrow, in the afternoon. We'll talk. That's all I'm promising. Just talk. Clara May. She read it over once, then folded it before she could second-guess herself. She walked back to the fence post and left it in the tin box, then went back to the house. That night, she pulled out all of his letters, every single one she'd kept, even the ones from before she knew who he was. She spread them across the table and read them by lamplight, one after another, seeing them now with different eyes. The man who'd written these words, he was still E. Still the person who'd answered her first letter when she thought no one would. Still the person who'd made her feel seen when the rest of the world had forgotten she existed. The name didn't change that. The inheritance didn't erase it. And maybe, that was enough to build on. Elias found the letter the next morning. He'd ridden out at dawn, as he always did, not really expecting anything. But when he opened the tin box and saw the envelope, his heart kicked hard against his ribs. He read it standing in the cool morning air, the sun just starting to climb above the horizon. And when he finished, he had to read it again to make sure the words hadn't changed. "You can come by tomorrow." He closed his eyes and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She wasn't forgiving him, not yet, but she was willing to try, and that was more than he'd hoped for. He spent the rest of the day preparing. He gathered tools. Good ones, not the worn-out things he'd been carrying. He loaded supplies into a wagon he'd borrowed from the livery. Nails, lumber, tar paper for the roof, everything he could think of that might be needed. By the time afternoon came, he was ready, but as he climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins, his hands were shaking. This was different from before. Before, he'd been a stranger, a drifter with nothing to lose. But now she knew who he was, knew what he came from. And if she turned him away now, it wouldn't just be rejection. It would be the end of something he hadn't realized he needed until it was almost gone. He drove the wagon slowly, giving himself time to steady his nerves. The road was still muddy from the rain, and the wheels left deep ruts behind him. When he crested the rise and saw the ranch spread out below, he pulled the horses to a stop. Everything looked different in the sunlight, greener, fresher, but also smaller somehow, more fragile, like a thing that could break if handled wrong. He took a deep breath, released it, and urged the horses forward. Clara was standing on the porch when he arrived. She'd changed out of her morning dress into something simpler, a worn cotton dress and an apron, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She looked tired, thinner than he remembered. But when she saw him, she straightened, and something in her expression steadied. He stopped the wagon near the corral and climbed down slowly, his hat in his hands. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the distance. Then Clara spoke. "You brought supplies." "I did." His voice was rougher than he'd intended. "Thought they might be useful. They will be." Another silence, this one longer. "Clara," he started. "Don't." She held up a hand. "Don't apologize again. I've read enough apologies. If you're here to help, then help. We can talk while we work." He nodded slowly. "All right." She walked down the porch steps and moved toward the barn. "The roof's the biggest problem. Every time it rains, water comes through in 3 places, ruined half the hay we had stored. I can fix that." "Good." She glanced at him, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been relief, or hope, or just exhaustion. "Then let's get started." They worked through the afternoon in near silence. Elias climbed onto the barn roof with the tar paper and nails, moving carefully over the old shingles. Clara worked below, clearing out the damaged hay and mucking the stalls. It was hard, physical labor, the kind that left no room for overthinking, but every so often one of them would glance at the other. Brief looks, quickly hidden, testing the weight of this new reality they were building. As the sun started to lower, Elias climbed down from the roof and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Clara was sitting on an overturned bucket near the corral, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged on her cheek. He walked over and sat on the fence rail nearby, leaving space between them. "It's holding," he said, gesturing to the roof. "Should be good through the next rain." "Thank you." He nodded, then after a pause, said quietly, "I meant what I wrote. About your letters. They changed me." Clara looked down at her hands. "I know." "Do you?" He turned to face her fully. "Because I need you to understand. The man who answered your letters, that was real. That was me, not the governor's son, not the inheritance, just me." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been thinking about that. About who you are versus who you were supposed to be." She finally looked up at him. "And I think maybe you're both. Maybe we all are. The person we're born as and the person we choose to become. And which one matters more, the one you choose." Her voice was soft but certain, every time. Something in his chest loosened. He wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to close the distance between them, but he didn't, because this wasn't about what he wanted. It was about earning back what he'd lost. "I'll keep coming by," he said, "if that's all right. There's more work than one person can do alone." "I know." She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "And yes, it's all right." He stood too. "Clara, one day at a time," she said, cutting him off gently. "That's all I can promise right now. That's enough." She nodded, then turned and walked toward the house. But before she went inside, she paused and looked back at him. "The tin box. We don't need it anymore, do we?" He understood what she was asking. The tin box had been for strangers, for people who couldn't face each other. But they weren't strangers anymore. No, he said. We don't, A small smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen from her since he'd arrived. Good. Then she went inside, and he stood there in the fading light, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, like maybe he'd finally found his way home. Over the following weeks, Elias came to the ranch almost every day. He fixed the fences, repaired the barn door, helped Clara move the cattle to better grazing now that the grass was growing back. They worked side by side, speaking when they needed to, but comfortable in silence when they didn't. Slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, the weight Clara had been carrying began to lighten. She'd catch herself laughing at something he said, or looking forward to the sound of his wagon coming up the road, or feeling, for the first time since her father died, like maybe the future wasn't just a void she was staring into. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she said, "I went through his things yesterday, my father's. There wasn't much, but I found letters." Elias glanced at her. "Letters? From my mother, before she died." Clara's voice was soft. He kept every one, tied with a ribbon and tucked in the bottom of his trunk. That's how he knew, Elias said quietly. Knew what? How much letters can matter? Clara looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. "I kept yours too," she admitted. "All of them. Even after everything. I kept yours." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases. Her handwriting. "I carry them with me, all of them." She stared at the letter in his hand, her throat tight. "Why?" "Because they remind me of who I want to be." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and in that light, Clara reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and sure. "One day at a time," she said quietly. "One day at a time," he agreed. Spring came in full force, turning the valley green and alive. The Holt Ranch, no longer failing, no longer forgotten, became a place where things grew again. Not just grass and crops, but hope. The kind that takes root slowly and doesn't announce itself until it's already blooming. Clara and Elias worked the land together, their partnership becoming something neither of them had planned but both had needed. They didn't speak much about the past, didn't dwell on what might have been. They just moved forward, day by day, building something new from the ruins of what had been. One morning, Clara walked out to the fence post where the tin box used to sit. She'd moved it weeks ago, storing it in the barn with the other things that belonged to a different time. But standing there now, looking out over the land, she thought about that first letter she'd written. The one meant for no one. The one that had somehow found its way to exactly the right person. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Elias came to stand beside her, his hands in his pockets, his hat tipped back. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How things change," she said. "How you can't always see it happening, but then one day you look around and realize everything's different. Is that good or bad?" She smiled. "Good, scary, both." He nodded, understanding. "You ever think about leaving, selling this place and going somewhere else?" "Sometimes." She looked at him. "Do you?" "No." His voice was certain. "Not anymore." They stood in silence, watching the wind move through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled, riding the thermals. The sky was clear and endless. "I forgive you," Clara said suddenly. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere between the barn roof and yesterday, I forgave you." Elias turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You didn't have to tell me that. I know. But I wanted you to know." He reached for her hand, and this time when their fingers intertwined, it didn't feel tentative or fragile. It felt solid. "Real." "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For writing that first letter. For leaving it where the wind could find it." She laughed softly. "For all I knew, no one would ever read it. But I did." "But you did." They walked back toward the house together, their shoulders almost touching. And as they did, Clara thought about all the words they'd written to each other over the months. All the letters carried by wind and hope and loneliness. They didn't need those letters anymore. But they'd always matter, because sometimes the quietest acts of courage, a letter written to a stranger, a reply left in the dust, are the ones that change everything. That evening, as the light faded and the first stars began to appear, Elias pulled something from his saddlebag, a leather-bound journal, new and unmarked. He handed it to Clara. I thought maybe we could start something new. Not letters, but stories. Things we want to remember. Things we don't want to forget. She opened it, ran her fingers over the blank pages. Together, together. She looked at him, this man who'd been a stranger and a mystery and a heartbreak and finally something steady and true. And she nodded. All right. That night, by lamplight, they sat at the kitchen table and wrote the first entry together. Not about the past, but about the present. About the work they'd done that day. About the foal that had been born in the pasture. About the way the rain had changed everything. And when they finished, Clara closed the journal and set it aside. Then she looked at Elias, really looked at him, and said, "Stay." He met her eyes. "I wasn't planning on leaving. No, I mean," she took a breath. "Stay here. Move your things from town. Make this your home." For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He stood, came around the table and pulled her into his arms. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in whispers. The prairie stretched dark and endless under the stars, but inside there was warmth and light, and two people who'd found each other across miles of loneliness and silence, who'd built a bridge from paper and ink, and who'd walked across it into something neither of them had expected but both had been searching for all along. Years later, when people told the story of the governor's son who'd come back to Coldwater and given away his fortune, they'd speak of it as an act of nobility, of a man trying to redeem his father's sins. But the people who knew, really knew, understood the truth. It wasn't nobility. It was love. Love for a woman who'd written letters to no one and somehow reached the one person who needed to hear them. Love for a land that had broken them both and then given them a place to heal. Love for the quiet, steady work of building something worth staying for. And sometimes, late at night, Clara would pull out the old tin box from where it sat on a shelf in the barn. She'd open it and run her fingers over the rust, remembering the girl she'd been, lonely and afraid, leaving words in the wind because she had nowhere else to put them. And she'd think about how far she'd come, how far they'd both come. The letters were gone now, stored away in a trunk, tied with ribbon like her father had kept her mother's. But the words remained, written not just on paper, but on the land they worked together, on the house they shared, on the life they'd built from dust and hope, and the stubborn belief that even the loneliest hearts could find their way home. The prairie kept their story the way it kept all stories, in the wind and the grass and the endless sky, a whisper between rain and sunlight, carried forever,